As we're prepping for our LG G5 coverage, one of the most interesting aspects about that phone is going to be its dual sensor camera. And a lot of you have been asking what those different sensors and different lenses might bring to the table. I'm Juan for Pocketnow, and we're going to take a quick look at why it's a big deal when a smartphone camera has a wide-angle lens. We're approaching something of a brick wall as we look at how we might improve future smartphone cameras. In the past, we've been able to increase sensor size, but as we approach the half-inch smartphone camera sensor, there's not really a lot of room for us to be able to continue packing in larger sensors while still keeping the overall phone shape fairly slim. Moving from a 1/3 inch sensor to the roughly half-inch sensor territory that we see on phones like the Galaxy S7 and the Lumia 950, we see terrific improvements to things like low light sensitivity. There's just more surface area for that sensor to soak up more light. But we also see improvements to the more photographic elements of our photos, things like depth of field blur. We get a prettier bokeh as we blur out items in the background. And in the past, we have played with even larger image sensors. This is a 2/3 inch sensor on the Lumia 1020, but it also comes with this Oreo lump on the back of the phone, which consumers seem to have not really particularly enjoyed. So the next trend in smartphone camera evolution seems to be multiple image sensors. Now, there are a couple different ways that we can go about cramming multiple cameras onto the back of our phone. We can have two of the exact same image sensors on the back of a phone. That still helps with low light sensitivity as we are still adding surface area for more light to be soaked up for each individual exposure. And with two of the same cameras on the back of the phone, we can also play with other photography, depth of field blur kinds of tricks. The strategy LG is employing on the G5, however, is having two different camera sensors on the back of that phone. There's the primary 16 megapixel sensor, which is going to be very similar in terms of performance to what we found on the LG V10. And there's also an 8 megapixel sensor with a very wide field of view. And if you've ever played with an interchangeable lens camera system like a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, you've probably noticed these little numbers on the top of every single lens. That number is your focal length. On a zoom lens, that focal length can change. The lower the number, the wider the shot. The higher the number, the more zoomed in your shot is. What makes LG's experiment so interesting here is a focus on focal length flexibility. A phone like the iPhone 6s or the upcoming iPhone SE uses a 1/3 inch image sensor. That means the background blur it produces won't be quite as nice as the larger image sensor from a phone like the LG V10. So LG figures they probably have the background blur effect pretty well handled just from the optics in the phone. Now, the iPhone might benefit from having two image sensors of the same focal length, as one lens can blur out the background and the other lens can focus on your subject. LG's probably figuring they don't need to mess with that as much, as this larger sensor and wider aperture already does a pretty good job of softening elements in your background. However, smartphones do have an issue in changing up the field of view, especially pushing wide. As long as you have enough resolution, you can use that image sensor resolution to crop the image. As you're cutting away at that image, you're essentially zooming in. And of course, if you cut away too much, the image quality will eventually degrade, as we do need some resolution to display details in your image. So we have zooming in pretty well covered for most consumer smartphone photography applications, but up till now, if we wanted to get more of the scene in each photo, our only solution has been to zoom out with our feet, literally walking away from the subject so we can see more of what's happening around that subject. And in the past, we have played with a couple variable focal length zoom lenses bolted onto the backs of phones, but if we weren't willing to put up with the larger Oreo sensor on the Lumia 1020, there are very few consumers who were really gravitating towards the idea of keeping a point-and-shoot camera in their pocket all the time. Yes, one guy in the comments who's complaining because this phone fit great in your cargo pants. For the rest of us, this was a bit much. So instead of bolting on all of that additional hardware, LG's just popping on a secondary image sensor and swapping in a wider focal length lens. So the primary 16 megapixel image sensor on the G5 is gonna have somewhere around a 28mm equivalent lens, which equates to around a 78-degree field of view. The secondary image sensor is going to open that way up, somewhere between a 9 and 10mm equivalent lens and a 135-degree field of view. That's huge. So the G5 is going to have a respectably wide field of view standard. It's going to have enough resolution to provide you a decent crop zoom. And then if you really want to open the frame up, you can. And we're able to cover all of that range without having a huge lump on the back of the phone. And before we wrap this video up, we have gotten a couple questions. If having a wide angle lens is so cool, why not just use that as the primary camera lens? And that comes down to the way that optics will distort the image as we start pushing wider and wider and wider. A 135-degree field of view is just at that border between a super wide angle lens and a fisheye lens. Once we start pushing that wide, it's really difficult to compensate for barrel distortion. Straight lines in your photos will bow out, and that effect continues to exaggerate as you get to the edges of that lens. We can also test this out using the front-facing cameras on the LG V10. If I take a picture of my face, I've got kind of a chubby face. But switching over to the wide angle lens and then also matching sort of how my head fits in the frame, that wider angle lens is stretching my face out even further. I mean, my face is chubby, but it's not that chubby. It just is a pro tip. If you're ever taking photos of your friends, keep the women in the middle of the shot, especially if you do have a slightly wider angle lens. No women enjoy being stretched wider than they really are. We're just starting to dig into review coverage on the LG G5, and the camera videos on this thing are gonna be brutal. It's gonna be an intense amount of content for us to shoot because we've got 2 different image sensors and a bunch of fun features that we need to take into account when we're actually reviewing that whole system. But we figured we could start the discussion off here, just taking a look at the differences between those 2 camera sensors, those 2 different lenses. And we know we're going to be in for some really interesting dual camera sensor fights as phones like the Huawei P9 come out. I hope this video has been able to help illustrate some of the differences we're going to see as we start comparing the optics on different smartphone camera systems. As always, folks, thanks so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe to this channel for future LG G5 and future smartphone camera coverage. And make sure you hit that thumbs up button for a little extra positive reinforcement. For Pocketnow, I'm Juan Carlos Bagnell. You can chat me up on Twitter and Instagram as Some Gadget Guy, and I will catch you all on the next video. That's huge!